I never imagined my quiet farmland would turn into a stage for HOA drama. Without permission, without notice, they rolled in with cameras, props, and attitudes, acting like my private property was their personal photoshoot location. They laughed it off when I warned them to leave. What happened next wasn't loud at first. It came from above, and it changed everything. It started quietly, almost invisibly, the way most serious violations do. My farmland had always been there, wide, open, productive, and clearly marked as private property. It wasn't abandoned land, it wasn't unused space, and it certainly wasn't public scenery. This land fed my family, supported my livelihood, and represented years of work, investment, and responsibility. Yet to the HOA, none of that seemed to matter. One morning, I noticed unfamiliar vehicles near the far edge of the fields. At first, I assumed it might be surveyors or someone who had taken a wrong turn. That happens sometimes in rural areas. But as I got closer, the picture became clearer, and more insulting. Branded cars, equipment cases, folding tables, camera rigs, people walking around confidently, as if they belonged there. They weren't lost. They weren't confused. They were setting up a full-scale photoshoot. The most shocking part wasn't the presence of the cameras, it was the attitude. No hesitation, no attempt to ask permission, no concern about boundaries. They behaved as though the land was already theirs to use, as though farmland was automatically free space, simply because it wasn't a shopping mall or a gated yard. This is a common but dangerous mindset, the idea that rural land has no owner worth respecting. The HOA representatives moved through the crops casually, stepping between rows, placing props directly on cultivated ground, and repositioning equipment without a second thought. Every footstep damaged soil that had been carefully maintained. Every tire track disrupted irrigation planning. Every careless movement risked weeks, sometimes months, of agricultural effort. To them, it was scenery. To me, it was work. To me, it was property. To me, it was protected by law. Farmland is not empty land. It is active, regulated, and often far more sensitive than residential property. Crops can be ruined by contamination. Soil structure can be damaged by unnecessary traffic. Even the presence of unauthorized people can raise liability and insurance issues. None of that crossed their minds. What crossed their minds was aesthetics. They wanted golden fields. They wanted a rustic vibe. They wanted visuals. And they wanted it without cost. This wasn't just trespassing, it was entitlement dressed up as confidence. When I approached them, I didn't come in shouting or threatening. I introduced myself calmly. I explained that this was private farmland and that they were not authorized to be there. I expected surprise, maybe embarrassment, maybe a quick apology followed by packing up. Instead, I was met with smiles that didn't reach the eyes. One of them laughed lightly and said something along the lines of, "We'll be done soon." Another waved a hand dismissively, as if my ownership was a minor inconvenience rather than a legal fact. Someone else mentioned that the HOA uses this area all the time, even though that statement was completely false. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a pattern. They genuinely believed that farmland, especially farmland not fenced like a suburban yard, was fair game. That belief didn't come from ignorance alone. It came from years of getting away with it. From people not pushing back. From landowners being ignored, pressured, or assumed irrelevant. HOAs often operate with an inflated sense of authority. Within their neighborhoods, they dictate paint colors, parking rules, mailbox designs, and landscaping choices. Over time, that control can bleed outward, creating a false impression that their authority extends beyond legal boundaries. But farmland exists outside that bubble. This land wasn't governed by HOA rules. It wasn't subject to their permissions. It wasn't part of their community assets. And yet, they treated it as if it were. The phrase, "It's just farmland," was spoken casually, almost as a justification. As if agricultural land had less value because it didn't have fences, driveways, or decorative lighting. As if the absence of houses meant the absence of rights. That sentence revealed everything. They didn't see a farmer. They didn't see an owner. They didn't see a business. They saw background. This kind of thinking is especially dangerous because it erases the human effort behind food production. Farmland is not static. It changes daily. Soil composition, moisture levels, crop stages, all of these require constant management. Unauthorized access can introduce pests, chemicals, or physical damage that doesn't show up immediately but has long-term consequences. Every minute they stayed on that land increased the risk. And yet, they continued. They adjusted lighting. They posed subjects. They shot angle after angle. All while standing on land they had no right to use. What made it worse was their confidence. They weren't hiding. They weren't rushing. They weren't acting like people who knew they were doing something wrong. That level of comfort only comes from a belief that consequences won't apply. That belief is the foundation of entitlement. I informed them again, more firmly this time, that they needed to leave immediately. I explained that continued presence would be documented. I mentioned legal implications. I mentioned liability. That's when the tone shifted slightly, not to concern, but to irritation. They didn't like being challenged. To them, I wasn't a landowner asserting rights. I was an obstacle interrupting their schedule. That reaction confirmed something important. They didn't think they were equals dealing with another property owner. They thought they were an organization dealing with an individual who would eventually back down. They miscalculated. Trespassing isn't just about crossing physical boundaries. It's about crossing social ones, the assumption that someone else's time, labor, and resources are less important than your convenience. By staying on my land after being warned, they crossed both. This wasn't a harmless photoshoot. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't negotiable. It was a clear violation backed by arrogance. And while they thought it didn't matter, that moment set everything else in motion. Because once someone shows you how little they respect your boundaries, the only question left is how you respond. They believed farmland was invisible. They believed the owner would stay quiet. They believed nothing would happen. That belief was their first mistake. And it was the foundation for everything that followed. There is a moment in every conflict when you realize words have reached their limit. You feel it clearly, not as anger, but as certainty. That moment arrived quietly for me as I stood at the edge of my field, watching them continue their photoshoot after every warning had been dismissed, laughed at, and ignored. They weren't confused. They weren't negotiating. They were deliberately choosing to stay. At that point, escalation wasn't about emotion. It was about process. Farming teaches patience, but it also teaches decisiveness. You don't argue with weather. You don't debate with pests. When a condition threatens your land, you respond correctly and within the rules. And I knew exactly what kind of response this situation required, one that was lawful, documented, and impossible to dismiss. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't touch their equipment. I didn't threaten anyone. I left. That alone confused them. They watched me walk away, clearly assuming they had won. Their laughter returned. The cameras kept rolling. In their minds, my departure confirmed everything they believed, that I had no real leverage, that my warnings were empty, that persistence beats principle. What they didn't know was that my response had already been scheduled days earlier. Because this was farmland, and farmland operates on calendars, not impulses. Earlier that week, I had arranged a routine agricultural operation, one that happens countless times every growing season across rural areas. Crop fertilization by air is not dramatic. It's efficient, regulated, and completely normal. Pilots follow strict guidelines. Materials are approved. Flight paths are logged. Notifications are filed. It's business as usual. And it just happened to be business that day. The decision wasn't made out of spite. It wasn't improvised. It wasn't reckless. It was a continuation of planned farm management, executed exactly as it would have been if no one else had ever stepped foot on the land. That distinction matters. Because what followed wasn't retaliation. It was consequence. As I coordinated remotely and ensured all protocols were followed, I understood something important. They had placed themselves inside an active agricultural operation. By refusing to leave private farmland after being warned, they accepted the risks that come with ignoring reality. Reality doesn't pause for photoshoots. The first sign that something was different came as a distant hum. At first, it blended into the background, easy to miss if you weren't listening for it. But gradually, it grew louder. The sound wasn't aggressive. It wasn't sudden. It was steady and unmistakable to anyone familiar with rural life. An aircraft. I wasn't there to see their initial reactions, but I've replayed the scene in my mind many times based on what followed. The casual glances upward. The brief confusion. The assumption that it was unrelated. That assumption lasted seconds. As the plane came into view, low and precise, the mood shifted instantly. This wasn't a sightseeing flight. This wasn't a mistake. This was a working aircraft following a planned route over active farmland. Their photoshoot froze. Someone shouted. Someone waved. Someone finally looked concerned. They were seeing, in real time, What happens when you treat farmland like a backdrop instead of an operation? Agricultural flights are designed for crops, not comfort. The materials are safe, approved, and essential, but they are also very real. They carry presence. They carry authority. And they make one thing abundantly clear: this land is not idle. Panic replaced mockery. Suddenly, the same people who had laughed at warnings were scrambling to protect cameras, props, clothing. Their confident posture collapsed into urgency. Orders were shouted. Equipment was abandoned. The carefully staged aesthetic dissolved into chaos. The photoshoot ended instantly. That alone was telling. No debate. No arguing. No confidence. Just retreat. Because consequences don't negotiate. What struck me later, after everything settled, was how fast respect appeared once power became visible. The land hadn't changed. The ownership hadn't changed. The law hadn't changed. The only difference was that reality had arrived in a form they couldn't talk over. That's the thing about unexpected responses. They work not because they are extreme, but because they are undeniable. I didn't need to confront them again. I didn't need to say, "I told you so." The situation spoke for itself. By placing themselves in the middle of an active agricultural process, they had exposed the flaw in their thinking. Farmland isn't empty space waiting to be borrowed. It's a system in motion. When you ignore that system, you don't stop it, you collide with it. Afterward, the tone changed completely. Calls were made. Apologies were offered. Explanations suddenly mattered. They wanted to discuss boundaries. They wanted to clarify ownership. They wanted assurances about future coordination. The same people who had brushed me off were now careful with their words, respectful in their approach, and very interested in documentation. Nothing about my authority had changed. Only their perception of it. That's an important lesson in any conflict involving entitlement. People often don't respect boundaries until they encounter a consequence that costs them time, money, or reputation. Until then, they test limits, assuming resistance is theoretical. The response didn't humiliate them publicly. It didn't endanger anyone. It didn't break a single rule. It simply reminded them where they were. And that reminder lingered. In the days that followed, I noticed changes. Notices were sent out. Maps were reviewed. Permissions were discussed where none had been before. My land was no longer referred to casually. It had a name again. An owner again. A presence again. That's what the unexpected response achieved. Not fear. Not revenge. Recognition. They learned that warnings aren't always meant to scare, they're meant to prevent. And when prevention fails, the response doesn't need to be loud. It needs to be inevitable. Farming has a way of teaching that lesson better than any argument ever could. You respect the process, or the process corrects you. Not out of anger, but out of function. They had mocked words. They couldn't mock reality. And once reality arrived from above, steady and unstoppable, everything changed. That was the moment they understood something they should have known from the beginning. This wasn't just land. It was working land. And it doesn't pause for anyone. Long after the noise faded and the field returned to its usual quiet, the real impact of that day began to surface. Consequences don't always announce themselves immediately. Sometimes they settle in slowly, reshaping behavior, language, and memory. This was one of those times. What happened on my farmland didn't just end a photoshoot, it rewired how those HOA representatives would think about boundaries forever. In the hours after the incident, the transformation was already visible. The same people who had laughed, dismissed, and mocked were suddenly careful. Their messages were formal. Their tone was measured. Words like misunderstanding and oversight appeared where arrogance had once lived. Requests replaced assumptions. Questions replaced commands. Respect arrived late, but it arrived fully dressed. They wanted reassurance. They wanted confirmation. They wanted closure. And above all, they wanted to make sure nothing like that would ever happen again. That's how you know a lesson has landed, not when someone admits fault publicly, but when their behavior changes privately. The next day, I received a call that sounded nothing like the conversations from before. No jokes. No shortcuts. No entitlement. They asked for clarification on property lines they had previously ignored. They requested documentation they once brushed off. They spoke carefully, as if every word now carried weight. Because now it did. They had learned something crucial. Ownership isn't just a concept, it's an operational reality. And when you ignore it, the consequences don't come in the form you expect. They don't come as arguments you can overpower or people you can intimidate. They come as systems you can't stop. What stayed with them wasn't embarrassment, it was disruption. The photoshoot they had planned for weeks was unusable. Time was lost. Money was wasted. Reputations were quietly questioned. Internally, there were explanations to give and decisions to justify. Someone had approved that location. Someone had assumed permission. Someone had been wrong. Those internal consequences echo longer than any public confrontation ever could. That's the part people underestimate. When entitlement fails publicly, it creates private reckoning. Suddenly, policies matter. Suddenly, permissions matter. Suddenly, landowners matter. In the weeks that followed, changes became noticeable beyond just their words. Notices were circulated reminding members that private farmland was not community property. Boundaries were remarked on internal maps. Event planning procedures were adjusted to require written consent where none had been required before. All of that came from one incident. Not a lawsuit. Not a shouting match. Not a viral confrontation. Just reality doing its job. And that's why the lesson stuck. They didn't walk away thinking, that guy overreacted. They walked away thinking, we underestimated the situation. There's a big difference. Underestimation forces humility. Overreaction invites dismissal. What happened that day couldn't be dismissed because it was lawful, routine, and entirely predictable, if they had bothered to think beyond their assumptions. The land didn't change. The rules didn't change. Their understanding did. That's what made it permanent. I've reflected many times on why this lesson was so effective, and the answer is simple. It targeted the core illusion they lived under, the illusion that farmland is passive. That it waits. That it accommodates. That it exists for convenience. Farmland doesn't negotiate. It operates. And when you step into its operation without permission, you don't just trespass, you interfere. Interference has consequences, whether you acknowledge them or not. They learned that the hard way. From then on, every interaction carried a trace of caution. No more casual references to open land. No more assumptions about access. When my property came up, it was mentioned with precision. With names. With boundaries. With respect. That's the mark of a lesson learned properly. What mattered most to me wasn't the apology, it was the prevention. Knowing that future landowners wouldn't face the same casual disrespect. That farmland would be treated as what it is, a working asset, a livelihood, and a protected space. That day created a reference point. Whenever someone internally questioned, can we just use this area? There was now an unspoken follow-up, remember what happened last time. Stories like that travel fast. And they linger. I didn't need acknowledgement beyond that. I didn't need validation or praise. The land returned to its rhythm. Crops grew. Seasons moved forward. But something invisible had changed in the background, an understanding had been installed where ignorance once lived. That's how real lessons work. They don't scream. They don't threaten. They endure. The wall would move on to other projects, other plans, other assumptions, but that one assumption would never return. The idea that my farmland was available by default died that day. Quietly. Permanently. And if there's one truth that remains, it's this. Boundaries don't need to be loud to be strong. They just need to be real. They crossed a line believing nothing would happen. Something did. And that's why they'll never forget it.